Hi, my name is Dr. Alan Branch. I'm professor of Christian ethics at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary here in Kansas City, Missouri. I want to offer you a couple of brief videos about racial reconciliation, racial issues from a Christian perspective, a conservative Christian perspective. And these two videos will address, first of all, in the first video, I'll talk about a brief cursory overview of race relations with particular emphasis here on the United States. And then in the second video, I'm going to bring in some biblical principles to apply to these issues of race and racial reconciliation, and try to touch on a couple of the issues which are of great concern to all of us. So to start this discussion, I want to bring up someone that I hold in very high regard. I'm a Georgia Bulldog fan, and I'm sure many of you have your favorite sports teams, and this is my favorite sports team. And the greatest player in the history of Georgia football is Herschel Walker, who won the Heisman Trophy in 1982 and led the team to the national title in 1980. Herschel comes from a small town in South Georgia named Wrightsville, and it's a fine town with many good people, but like lots of towns in the South, had its own journey with racial reconciliation. Well, Herschel led his high school football team to a state title in the fall of 1979. The football field there at his school is named after him today. I had my picture taken there once. But Herschel, his senior year, according to the New York Times, an article back in 1982, after his high school team won the state title, there was a banquet at a local country club for the players, but Herschel was not invited, apparently for racial reasons. And he never talked about that much, and he's had a successful life at so many levels. But I guess I just tell that story about someone I hold in unusually high regard and whom I admire very much to help us understand these are real stories about real people. These are not just things made up. And I want to keep in perspective that we have real people in mind that really get affected. So with that, let's say a few things as well. Just some background. Many have argued the first missionary from the United States was actually an African American, George Leal. He was from my home state, Georgia. He had been converted as a slave. His owner enabled him to become free. By the way, when Georgia was started as a colony, it didn't have slavery. Slavery didn't come to a couple of decades later. But nonetheless, they're in Savannah, and he winds up, has to move out with the royalist. He had been pro-British during the war, but winds up going to Jamaica in 1782, and he actually baptized thousands. Now, he wasn't actually sponsored by a mission agency, but the fact is he won tons of people to faith in Jesus Christ there in Jamaica. And I just point this out to say that we as Christians have one goal, and that should be to win more people to faith in Jesus Christ, and that should be more people knowing Jesus, and evangelism should be at our forefront as we think about these issues. So my goal in talking about these things is that more people come to faith in Jesus Christ, and the church reflects what it should from the Bible and from the Lord himself. So let me give you a definition of racism. A learned belief. I want to emphasize the word learned. I don't think people are born racist. We're born sinners, but I don't think you were just born a racist. A learned belief in racial superiority, which includes the belief that race determines intellectual, cultural, and moral capacities. You see, racism says what you can determine about someone's ability and potential in life is determined by their skin color, or the tribe or the people group from which they originate. It includes both racial prejudice and discrimination. These seem to be subsets of racism. And so prejudice itself is really when you form a preconceived negative opinion about another person without grounds for doing so. And prejudice isn't limited to racism, but prejudice is one way racism is expressed. So you form a negative opinion about someone without any real reason for doing so. So Tony Evans says something I think is interesting. In what I have here, I focus on the relationship between blacks and whites, African Americans, Caucasians, here in the United States. And I realize that when we talk about the issue of race, many of you are watching from around the world, and my students come from many backgrounds. And so I'm aware, of course, of racial tensions in Afghanistan between different groups. racial tensions between the Hutus, or really ethnic tensions, tribal tensions between the Hutus and Tutsis in Africa back 25 years ago in Rwanda and Burundi. All sorts of racial and ethnic issues. Armenians and Turks prior to and during World War I. So this is a universal issue. No people group on the face of the planet Earth is free from these sort of tensions. But I am focusing on African Americans and whites, blacks and whites here in what I say. Well, why is that? I think Tony Evans, pastor of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship, Dr. Tony Evans, gives a good reason to try to focus on this, and here it is. While racial tension can also be seen in many other ways, whether through swastikas painted on synagogues or Hispanics marching against concern of racial profiling in the passage of immigration legislation, it is the black-white relationship that has set the bar of racial division the highest here in the United States, he means. Given the length and volatile history of this divide in the United States, if we can ever get this right, we will have developed a template for addressing wherever else this evil shows up in the culture. I think he's right. I think that gives a reasonable explanation for focusing on these two groups here in the States. So let's talk about slavery in America, the colonial era to the Constitution. I'm going to move quickly here. This is just a cursory overview. So I do think we should keep in mind that America was not somehow worse than other nations at that time or in that era. In fact, I'm prepared to argue we were better, but the point being, slavery was the common experience in human history up to this point. And so to that degree, America wasn't different from anyone else. Now, it doesn't excuse slavery or mean that we should just ignore it or give a moral pass to everything that was done. That's not what I'm saying. But it does mean that we should temper our critiques of the founding of America, because at that time it was not different than any other nation in the world. So the beginning of the slave trade, the first public sale of slaves in Europe occurred at Lagos, Portugal in 1444. So how many slaves, human beings, Africans, were forcibly transported across the Atlantic in the slave trade? It's hard to get precise data. The guess is perhaps 10 to 12.5 million people embarked, and perhaps 2 million died in transit, so perhaps around 10.5 million actually make the entire trip. Here's what John Newton said. Of course, he became a Christian, and he wrote a little book called Thoughts Upon the African Slave Trade in 1788. He had been a slave trader, and he's describing what he saw, and this book was very influential in the abolitionist movement in England, and he was a real proponent for ending slavery because of his own experience. And he talked about how the Africans were forcibly laid down row upon row, almost like cords of wood. And he said, "Let it be observed that the poor creatures thus cramped for want of room are likewise in irons, for the most part both hands and feet, and two together." So their hands and feet are chained, and then they're chained together, which makes it difficult for them to turn or to move or attempt to rise or lie down without hurting themselves or each other. A horrid description of the transatlantic slave trade. This gives you an idea. Most of the Africans were enslaved from this part of Africa and this part of Africa, what's now modern-day Nigeria and that general region, Angola and that general region. The vast majority of slaves or Africans were actually taken to the Caribbean and South America, not so many to the colonies in North America, so certainly quite a few. So prior to 1650, most of the slave trade was occurring from what's now the Democratic Republic of Congo and Angola, and that continued on through the end of slave trade, but there was a shift more toward the north, what we consider sub-Saharan Africa, though it had always been there as well, but these are general trajectories. 1619, again, the first slaves come to Jamestown, actually from a Dutch ship, and they had captured them from a Spanish ship. These folks were from what is now Angola. And when they came there, they were originally going to serve as indentured servants, but eventually lifelong servitude became the norm for slaves in Virginia, and by 1662 it legally recognized slavery. In the 1700s, this notion of just being an indentured servant is long, long gone. The first public slave auction in the United States, 1638, it did accelerate the slave trade and the terrible Middle Passage, which gets worse, but again, most Africans were taken to Central, South America, the Caribbean. Most who were taken there. Why Africans as slaves and not other people? Well, first of all, European diseases had decimated Native Americans, smallpox and these horrible plagues that just killed so many people. They had no natural defense, and a horrid thing. It was also a matter of supply. There was a previously existing slave trade in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, and this goes back to Islam. So the first slave traders in Africa were not white Europeans, it was Islam. And this continued on after the American Civil War. So that was on the East Coast in Madagascar and those sort of things, but it was already there, and tribes would steal slaves from each other, and so what you had was, in many cases, internecine tribal warfare, and then stealing slaves from each other, and then African tribes selling these slaves to Europeans. Finally, the color of skin made it difficult for Africans to hide if they escaped, and in this way, a particular group of humans is abused because they are easily identifiable. So especially here in the States, if you have a white planter class and you want to know, well, who's a slave and who's not a slave? If you just say, we're going to enslave people from that skin pigmentation over there, then the assumption is if you're black that you're a slave until proven otherwise. And so these three reasons tend to be why it was Africans as slaves. Of course, there were other reasons, but these three are prominent. How many slaves were actually in the colonies? Well, what we do know is that by the 1790 census, there were around 700 slaves recorded, and most of those in the South. The Declaration of Independence in 1776 originally had a statement that said that King George III was guilty of captivating and carrying Africans into slavery into another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. That was condemnation of slavery was originally in the Declaration of Independence, but it was edited out in deference to Southern slaveholders and to Northern slave traders. So at the same time, the Declaration, so yes, it could have been stronger. But at the same time, the Declaration of Independence contained the central idea, which is the death knell for slavery, and it's an idea that comes out of Christian theology, which is all men are created equal. So in the long run, it was that principle that won out in the United States. Regrettably, not sooner, but eventually it did. So when the Constitution was finally drafted in 1787 after the Articles of Confederation did not work, in the original version of the Constitution, Article 1(2) counted slaves as a 3/5 ratio for apportionment purposes when you're figuring out how many representatives the state gets in the House of Representatives. It's 3/5 ratio, 3/5 compromise it's called. Well, on one hand, slaves were counted as 3/5 a person, which is degrading to humanity. But at the same time, this political compromise, and lots of political compromises we don't like, what it did do, if the slave population had been counted completely for apportioning congressmen in the House of Representatives, slaveholders would have had a much larger voice in the Congress because most of the slaves, by and large, were in the South. So it did, to a degree, mitigate the representative nature of slaveholders in the Congress. So it's like a lot of compromises, we just don't like it. So let's talk about from the Constitution to the Civil War. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin in 1792, and this suddenly makes cotton very profitable. Of course, rice and sugar are labor intensive as well, but the slave population burgeons from 1.1 million in 1810 to almost 4 million by the time of the Civil War in 1860. The United States actually outlawed the transatlantic slave trade, the importation of slaves, in 1807, about the same time that England did. So what happened was England actually legally abolished it several years later, but America took a civil war to do it. So the slave trade was itself actually outlawed. However, the intranational, that means within the nation, the slave trade within states, that continued. Of course, slaves continued to be smuggled in from time to time, and so there was still smuggling of slaves, but it was technically illegal, and the United States actually had ships off the coast of West Africa trying to stop this thing. But the importation of slaves stopped, but not slavery itself. Between 1877 and I use the year 1827, all the northern states abolished slavery. It was New York had outlawed it in 1817, but the law finally went into effect in 1827. And let us not forget the exploitation of Native Americans, the Trail of Tears, the deportation of Native Americans from the southeastern United States, forced removal to the Indian Territory, now the state of Oklahoma, and this just typifies relations with Native Americans, and thousands of people died in this forced migration. The experiment of Liberia was an attempt to immigrate African Americans back to Africa. About 19,000 actually did so, and that was, of course, the question was many people were struggling with in the early part of the 1800s in the United States as well. If one frees all the slaves, then what does one do with them? And so some were saying, well, what we should do is start a movement back to Africa, and that's where we get the nation Liberia today. The Fugitive Slave Act was a bad law in 1850. Many suggest it precipitated the Civil War, but what it did was it made it more difficult for slaves to free themselves via the Underground Railroad, because under this law, fugitive slaves could not testify on their own behalf, nor were they allowed trial by jury. I mean, this is a violation of basic civil rights. And slave hunters were allowed to capture an escapee in any territory or state, and were required only to confirm orally before a state or federal judge the person was a runaway. He could just grab anyone, even if they're a freeman, and say, oh yeah, this person's a slave, and that's all he had to do. And so it's a system set up for exploitation and violence, and it was a bad law. And in fact, many believe that in some ways it was a precipitating event for the Civil War. I think it certainly was, amplified by Dred Scott versus Sanford, along with, in my opinion, Roe v. Wade and Doe v. Bolton in 1973, and Obergefell versus Hodges, one of the worst Supreme Court decisions ever. So declared Dred Scott a non-citizen, a being of inferior nature, is what it called black people, African Americans. 5 of the judges who ruled in the majority were actually slaveholders themselves. I don't know why they didn't recuse themselves from this, but many argue this ruling basically precipitated the Civil War. There's Dred Scott himself. So this is a horrid decision. In the Civil War, you have almost 625,000 Americans die from both sides, Union and Confederate, when you take up the number. And after the Civil War, you get Reconstruction to Jim Crow. So there were basically three amendments added to the United States Constitution to straighten out the problem of slavery. So in the 13th Amendment, it abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment guarantees civil rights, and the 15th Amendment guarantees blacks the right to vote, these freed slaves the right to vote. Well, it took a while to make everyone understand we really believe those things. Actually, the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. Out of this, you get Reconstruction. So you have the South, which has declared war against the nation, and now they're occupied by a military force. And so you have all these thousands and thousands, millions of freed slaves. So the federal government undertook a major effort to correct the problem of slavery and try to educate and to promote economic success and these other things. But this basically ended with a political compromise of 1877 between Southern Democrats and Northern Republicans. All had to do with some disputed election results for the presidential election that year, and basically they cut a deal. Hey, if you'll let the Republicans have the White House, we'll end Reconstruction. I'm oversimplifying, but that's basically what happened. Then in 1896, you get this horrible decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, a 7-1 decision, which gives you the separate but equal nonsense, which gives you all this Jim Crow legislation of the late 1800s and for the first half of the 20th century. Around that time in 1915, a movie is released called Birth of a Nation. This movie is highly influential, and what it does is it presents the KKK as this wonderful organization. It's a blockbuster, and it just gets tons of viewing. And Also, in the early 20th century, there were some changes in agriculture. It starts to become more mechanized in the South. Boll weevils come in and destroy the crops. African Americans who did own small farms in the South are losing their farms because of these boll weevil infestation. Also, there's this economic recession in the South that's really grinding. Of course, not to mention all the other issues related to racism. But these factors encourage what's called the Great Migration, which is the movement of African Americans from the South to the North, to northern cities for work. Around this time, you have the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. And the second generation of the Ku Klux Klan. So let me be clear. There's three phases. First, there's the post-Civil War Ku Klux Klan, which was obliterated by President Grant. He treated it as a terrorist organization, which it was, and rightly so. He took the brute force to them and suppressed them, and it ceased to exist as an organization. But in the early 20th century, 1915, it restarts again, and this time it's much broader in its hatred. It's not just black people. It's non-Europeans. It's non-Protestants. It's non-Northern Europeans. We don't like the Eastern Europeans. It's anti-immigrant, all these sort of things. Doesn't like Jews. And then that morphs again to a more fragmented movement in the late 20th century, early 21st century, is sometimes calling themselves Christian Identity Movement, which is not Christian in any way. So let me just go ahead and say a few things about the rise of the Klan in the early 20th century. There was a lynching of a man named Leo Frank in Georgia. Actually was killed in the town right across the county line from where I grew up at, Marietta, Georgia. And he was wrongly accused of killing little Mary Fagan, 13-year-old girl at the Atlanta pencil factory. He was killed because he was Jewish. He was lynched because he was Jewish on August 17, 1915. And the guys that did this killing, this murder of Leo Frank, called themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan, supposedly defending her virtue. That group, the Knights of Mary Fagan, morphed into the Ku Klux Klan. Thanksgiving night, 1915, some of those guys pull a group together and they burn a cross on top of Stone Mountain outside of Atlanta, Georgia, and they restart the Ku Klux Klan. And it's this second generation, the Ku Klux Klan, which is supposedly white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant. Just gives you a picture. These are Klan marches in Washington, D.C. in 1925 and 1926. And you will misunderstand this second generation of the Klan if you see it only as a regional organization. Large membership in Michigan, large membership in Missouri, large membership in states outside of the traditional South. For example, this is a KKK float in Washington State in 1926 during a parade. This is an advertisement from the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1924. So it was this broader movement, but it basically implodes within because of financial scandal and some other things. And today it's a widely fractured and splintered organization. The federal government finally infiltrated it, had some wise use of some RICO laws, racketeering laws, to prosecute the Klan back in the day in the 50s or 60s and 70s. So it's very splintered and a lot of the bizarre things going on there. So let's say a few words about the civil rights movement. This deserves a whole lecture in itself, and again, I'm just trying to give a cursory overview. Let's say a word about Harry Truman. He desegregated the military in 1948. This is a big deal. God bless Harry Truman. And then you get Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, where the Supreme Court mandates desegregation of schools, and it took about 15 to 16 years to get that all worked out. Of course, Rosa Parks and Dr. King and the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott in 1955, nonviolent resistance to effect change, most effectively done in Montgomery. The Central High School Little Rock riots. By the way, these two ladies, here and here, this lady who's screaming at her and yelling at her, they actually reconciled years later. It's a good thing. People can forgive each other, and that's what we want to hope for. Finally, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 basically says all those amendments we added after the Civil War, we really mean, and we really mean that people should vote. Well, in some states prior to the Civil Rights Act, you had about 8% African American participation an election, that means 8% of the eligible black voters were actually participating. After the Civil Rights Act, those numbers go way, way up. But I want to make sure you understand the Civil Rights Act was not just for African Americans. It also helped poor whites. A lot of poor whites were being excluded from their basic right to vote because of some things. So there was kind of this rich elite class that kind of wanted to run things in the South, and so it not only affected blacks but poor whites. So here's what you need to know. This is a point of distinction and a point of argument, but I'm just going to say it. I am a conservative politically and theologically, so let me give this word of just thought for you. The Civil Rights Act is generally viewed very positively by people like me. I do myself. But at the same time, President Johnson initiated what we call now the Great Society, or his war on poverty, and this whole host of social programs that came out of that. Conservatives such as myself basically say the Civil Rights Act did much good, and we affirmed the right to give people the right, constitutional right to vote, and to make sure that happens. But it is these social programs coming out of the Great Society and the war on poverty where we have a lot of pushback. And in fact, people like me argue, and I think I have strong evidence to make this claim, it is those programs that have a stronger negative impact on people of all ethnic backgrounds, but they have not been helpful for the poor, and in fact have encouraged people to stay in cycles of poverty. So what you'll basically get out of conservatives is Civil Rights Act, yay, war on poverty, boo, that has not worked, and it's not worked well. So take me for wealth and poverty, we'll talk more about that. I'm going to scoot past the issue of busing. The Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME Church killing our friends in Jesus, our brothers and sisters in Christ, killed by a white supremacist, which I'm not going to dignify by naming in this lecture. But just to help us understand, these issues haven't gone away. Wow, what do we say about Dr. King? I want to stress a few things. In Letter from Birmingham City Jail, which is, I think, one of the best pieces of persuasive writing and speech that I've ever come across, he does something which I think is helpful. He says, I'm appealing to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the Founding Fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. If you watch what he's saying there, he's appealing to conservative white Christians in the South, and what he's saying is, I'm only asking for the very best parts of the American dream. That's what I'm asking for. And he's able to state his argument in such a way that a patriotic white American in 1963 can say, okay, I can support racial reconciliation. I can acknowledge we've had some bad things happen in our country's past, but I can still say God bless America and yay 4th of July and salute the flag and all those things. So I think this is a balanced approach. Frankly, a lot of what I'm hearing today has lost the wisdom of what he's doing right here, and attempts to say that we're going to solve racial reconciliation by demonizing everything in American history are doomed to failure, and they will not be persuasive with a large group of people, frankly, because I just don't think it's right to demonize everything in American history. We celebrate the good, we acknowledge the bad, and we try to move forward. One of the greatest statements ever, I have a dream that one day my 4 little children will live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Well, amen. And then finally, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, 4 children. This is a little girl who's been killed, if you're looking at this. These white racists blew up the church. They're getting ready to go out and sing. And these, again, are our sisters in Christ, little girls getting ready to go sing. So this event in the South, in my opinion, really pushed white conservative Christians to realize, you know what, we know who the bad guys are here, and we know who the good guys are here, and we need to give off our hands on these things. So that is a good stopping place. I'd like to talk more about anti-Semitism on another video and another time. But for right now, we're going to stop right there. And again, our focus was on the relationship of blacks and whites here in the United States, because this has been the source of tension in my nation. I realize I have students watching from around the world, but I do hope this will help you at least get some sense of the history. And in the next video, I'm going to scoot through some Bible passages and some principles, I hope, which will be helpful for racial reconciliation.